The bay gelding picked his way down the rocky slope while Rip Campbell studied the valley stretched out below. Green grass ran for miles between the hills, broken by a creek that twisted like a snake's back in the morning sun. Good water. Good graze. A man could run cattle here and make something of himself. If he wanted to make something of himself. Rip touched his heels to the horse's flanks, and they moved down toward the valley floor. The wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, different smells than Texas. Everything here seemed bigger somehow, the sky wider, the horizons farther away, a place where a man might lose himself if he had a mind to. The gelding's hooves crunched on gravel as they reached the creek. Rip stepped down and let the horse drink while he filled his canteen. The water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. He cupped some in his hands and splashed it on his face, felt the mountain chill of it. When he looked up, 2 riders sat their horses on the opposite bank. "Morning," the older one called. He wore a black hat and a vest over a white shirt, clean-shaved, maybe 50 years old. The kind of man who gave orders and expected them followed. "Morning," Rip said. "You'd be the fellow from the wagon train." It wasn't a question. Word traveled fast in empty country. "I would." "Heard you left some folks with the Mormons down south. Heard you handled yourself when the Sioux got frisky." Rip said nothing. He corked his canteen and hung it on his saddle horn. The man on the black hat's left was younger, maybe 25, with pale eyes and gun handles that showed wear. He kept his hands loose on his reins, but his gaze never left Rip's face. "Name's Hartwell," the older man said. "I run cattle in this county, always looking for good men. I'm just passing through." "That so? Where you headed?" "North. Maybe find some cow work in Wyoming Territory." Hartwell smiled. "Son, you're in Wyoming Territory. This here's Johnson County." Rip looked around the valley again. The grass waved in the breeze like ocean swells. Good country for cattle. Best in the territory. Course it takes the right kind of man to work it. Some folks think they can just squat anywhere, run a few head, call themselves ranchers. The younger rider shifted in his saddle. His horse jigged sideways. "Easy, Danny," Hartwell said. "Man's got a right to his opinions." He looked back at Rip. "You know cattle?" "Some." "Know the difference between an honest brand and a running iron?" "I do." "Good. We got troubles with rustlers hereabouts. Stock Growers Association's fixing to do something about it." Hartwell gathered his reins. "You change your mind about passing through. There's work at the KC Ranch. 5 miles northeast, follow the creek. Tell Tom Horn that Hartwell sent you." The 2 men turned their horses and rode back up the slope. Rip watched them go, then swung into his saddle. The bay shook his head and snorted. "Easy, boy." Rip patted the horse's neck. "Just cowboys being neighborly." But something in Hartwell's tone suggested the neighborliness might not extend to everyone in Johnson County. Rip had heard that tone before, usually right before things got complicated. He rode upstream, following the creek as it wound through stands of cottonwood and willow. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his back through the wool shirt. Somewhere ahead lay the KC Ranch, and whatever work might be found there. Behind him lay the Mormon settlement where he'd left the wagon train survivors, and beyond that the graves on the Oregon Trail. One grave in particular. Rip touched the bay's sides, and they moved into an easy lope. The sooner he found work, the sooner he could earn enough money to head back to Texas. Back to country that made sense, where a man knew the rules and who made them. He'd stay in Wyoming just long enough to fill his pockets, no longer than necessary. The creek curved east, and the KC Ranch buildings appeared in the distance, dark shapes against the green grass. Smoke rose from a chimney. Men moved around the corrals. It looked like any working ranch in cattle country. But Rip had learned not to trust appearances. The war had taught him that, and the years since had reinforced the lesson. Every place had its own troubles, its own version of right and wrong. He rode toward the ranch buildings, wondering what version of trouble he'd find in Johnson County. Tom Horn stood in the shade of the barn, watching Rip ride in. He was a compact man with gray in his mustache and scars on his hands that spoke of rope work and hard living. When Rip dismounted, Horn walked over and looked at the bay gelding. "Good horse," Horn said. "Mexican?" "Texas bred. His daddy was a Mustang." Horn ran his hand down the horse's front leg, checking for soundness. The bay stood patient under the examination. "Hartwell said you might have work." "Might." Horn straightened up. "Depends on what you can do besides sit a horse." "I can work cattle. Know my way around a rope and a branding iron." "Most men say that. Fewer can prove it." Two cowboys emerged from the bunkhouse, drawn by the sight of a stranger. One was tall and raw-boned with red hair, the other shorter and dark-complexioned. Both wore guns and carried themselves like they knew how to use them. "Boys, this here's—" Horn paused. "Campbell, Rip Campbell." Campbell rode up from the Mormon settlement. Says he can work cattle. The redhead spat tobacco juice into the dust. "We got cattle that need working." Horn ignored him. "Where you from, Campbell?" "Texas, originally. Been other places since." "What kind of other places?" Rip met his eyes. "The kind where men settle differences with guns." "The war?" "Among other things." Horn nodded as if something had been confirmed. "I'm short 2 men. Lost one to a broken leg. Another decided he didn't like the climate here." "Too hot?" the dark-haired cowboy asked, grinning. "Too hot for some," Horn said. "This here's Ben Murphy." He indicated the redhead. "And that's Charlie Flores. Boys, meet Rip Campbell." Murphy stepped forward and offered his hand. His grip was firm, calloused from rope work. Flores did the same. "You boys show Campbell the bunkhouse," Horn said. "Get him settled. We'll see how he handles himself come morning." "What about his horse?" Murphy asked. "Put him in the corral with the remuda. We'll see if he gets along with the others." Rip unsaddled the bay and turned him loose with the ranch horses. The gelding sniffed noses with a few of them, then moved to the water trough. No trouble there. The bunkhouse was a long, low building with bunks for 12 men. Only half were occupied. Rip chose an empty bed near the window and stowed his gear in the wooden box beneath it. "Quiet around here," he said. "Wasn't always," Flores said. "Had a full crew this time last year." "What happened?" Murphy glanced toward the door, then back at Rip. "Some boys didn't like the way the wind was blowing, pulled their stakes and headed for Montana." "What kind of wind?" "The kind that brings trouble." Flores sat on his bunk and pulled off his boots. "You ever hear of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association?" "Once or twice. They run things in this county, decide who's a legitimate rancher and who's a rustler. Problem is, their definition of rustler keeps getting broader. KC Ranch have troubles with them?" "Not yet," Murphy said. "But we're not big enough to be in the association, and we're too big to be ignored." Horn appeared in the doorway. "Campbell, walk with me." They went outside. The sun was getting low, painting the hills orange and purple. Horn pulled a paper from his vest pocket and handed it to Rip. "You can read?" "I can." The paper was a wanted poster. The face looked back at Rip from a poor sketch, but the name was clear enough. Nathan Champion. Wanted for cattle rustling. "You know this man?" Horn asked. "Never seen him. He runs a small outfit north of here." "Good man, from what I hear. Honest." Rip handed the poster back. But the association says he's a rustler. Put a price on his head." "You believe them?" Horn folded the paper and put it away. "I believe a man ought to be tried in court, not shot down like a dog." He looked at Rip. "Some folks disagree with that notion." "What's that got to do with me?" "Nothing if you're just passing through. Everything if you're staying." Rip watched the last light fade behind the hills. "I'm not staying. Good to know where a man stands." Horn turned toward the house. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late." Rip walked back to the bunkhouse. thinking about Nathan Champion's face on that wanted poster. In his experience, when men started putting prices on other men's heads, the shooting usually started soon after. He'd planned to stay just long enough to earn traveling money. Maybe he'd better make it quick. The church bell rang across Buffalo Creek as Rip tied his bay to the hitching rail. Murphy had insisted he come along, said it was expected of KC ranch hands to show themselves in town on Sundays. "Makes us look respectable," Murphy had said, brushing dust off his black coat. Rip wore his cleanest shirt and the wool pants he'd saved for Sundays back in Texas. The clothes felt strange after a week of range work, like wearing another man's skin. The church was a simple frame building with white paint that had seen better years. People filed through the front door, the men in dark suits, the women in dresses with bonnets and shawls. Rip followed Murphy and Flores inside, took a seat in the back row. The preacher was a thin man with a voice that carried to the rafters. He spoke about shepherds and sheep, about wolves in the wilderness. Rip let the words wash over him while he studied the congregation. Most were town folks: the banker, the mercantile owner, the man who ran the livery stable. A few ranchers sat in the front rows, their wives beside them, their children scrubbed and quiet. In the middle sat a woman with brown hair and a boy maybe 10 years old. The woman turned once during the service, her eyes meeting Rip's for a moment before she looked away. She had an open face, the kind that showed her thoughts plain as writing on paper. After the service, people gathered outside in the shade of the cottonwoods. The women talked in small groups, while the men discussed cattle prices and the weather. Murphy introduced Rip to several townspeople, their names sliding past him like water. The woman with the boy approached them. Up close, Rip could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30, with laugh lines around her eyes. "Mrs. McKenna," Murphy said. "This here's Rip Campbell, our new hand." "Sarah McKenna." She offered her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from work. "This is my son, Billy." The boy stepped forward and shook Rip's hand with serious ceremony. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Campbell." "Likewise." "Billy's been asking about the new cowboy at the KC," Sarah said. "I told him cowboys are just regular men who happen to work with cattle." "Some of us are more regular than others," Murphy said, grinning. Sarah smiled back, but her eyes stayed on Rip. "Are you from around here, Mr. Campbell?" "Texas, just passing through." "Heading somewhere in particular?" "Back to Texas, eventually." Billy's face fell. "You just got here." "Billy?" his mother said quietly. "I was hoping you might tell me about Texas," the boy said. "I never met anyone from there before." Rip looked at the boy's eager face, then at Sarah McKenna. She was watching him with that open expression, waiting to see what kind of man he was. "Not much to tell," Rip said. "Hot in summer, cold in winter, lots of sky." "Do you miss it?" The question caught him off guard. He thought of Rachel's grave beside the trail, of the life they'd planned together that would never be. "Sometimes." Across the churchyard, several men had gathered around a tall figure in an expensive suit. Their voices carried on the still air, though Rip couldn't make out the words. The man in the suit gestured toward the hills, his face serious. "That's Mr. Davidson from the Stock Growers Association," Sarah said, following his gaze. "He's been coming to town more often lately." "What's he want?" "To make sure we understand how things are." Sarah's voice had changed, gone cooler. "He says there are rustlers operating in the county, says honest ranchers need to band together against them." Murphy spat into the grass. "Davidson's idea of honest ranching involves owning half the territory." "Murphy," Sarah warned, glancing around. "It's true. His association decides who belongs and who doesn't. Small ranchers like you and Nate Champion don't rate." Sarah's face tightened at Champion's name. "Nate's a good man." "Good men have been hanged for less than what they're accusing him of," Murphy said. Billy tugged at his mother's skirt. "Can we go home now?" "In a minute." Sarah looked back at Rip. "Will we see you in town again, Mr. Campbell?" "Maybe. I hope so." Billy could use some stories about Texas, even if there's not much to tell. She smiled when she said it, and for a moment, Rip felt something shift inside him, like ice cracking on a winter pond. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Sarah McKenna gathered her son and walked toward a buckboard parked by the mercantile. Rip watched them go, noting the way she held herself straight despite the weight she carried. "Nice woman," Murphy said. "Lost her husband 2 years back. Ranch accident." "She seems to be managing." "She is. Question is whether Davidson and his friends will let her keep managing." Rip looked back at the group around Davidson. The men were nodding at whatever he was saying, their faces grim. "What's that mean?" "Means the association's got ideas about who belongs in Johnson County," Murphy said. "And who doesn't." The KC herd stretched across the meadow like scattered dark stones. Rip rode beside Horn, checking brands and counting head while the morning dew still dampened the grass. "See that steer there?" Horn said, pointing with his chin. "The one with the crooked horn." Rip studied the animal, a 2-year-old Hereford with the KC brand burned deep into his hip. "What about him?" "Bought him from a homesteader named Peters last fall. Peters claimed he raised him from a calf, had the bill of sale and everything." Horn spurred his horse closer to the steer. The animal lifted his head, chewing cud, watching them with dark eyes. "Look closer at that brand." Rip leaned in his saddle. The KC was clear enough, but underneath it he could make out the ghost of another mark. Faint lines where a running iron had changed one brand into another. "Peters didn't raise that calf." "No, he didn't. Question is, did Peters know it when he sold him to me?" They rode on through the herd. Horn pointed out other animals, their histories written in burned flesh and altered marks. Some showed honest wear, the natural spreading that came with age and weather. Others told different stories. "How many head you figure are wearing borrowed brands?" Rip asked. "Maybe 1 in 20, maybe more." Horn reined up beside a water hole where several cattle had gathered to drink. "Thing is, it's hard to tell sometimes. Brands fade, get scarred over. A man sees what he wants to see, or what he's paid to see." "That too." A rider approached from the east, dust rising behind his horse. Rip recognized Charlie Flores by his seat in the saddle. "Tom," Flores called as he rode up. "Got visitors at the house." "Who?" "Davidson from the association. Brought 2 men with him. They're waiting on the porch." Horn cursed under his breath. "What's he want?" "Didn't say, but he's got papers in his hand." The 3 men rode back toward the ranch buildings. Davidson's horse stood at the hitching rail alongside 2 others, all of them fine animals with expensive tack. The kind of horses that cost more than most cowboys made in a year. Davidson sat in a chair on the porch, a leather portfolio across his knees. His 2 companions stood behind him, their hands loose at their sides. Both wore guns in worn holsters. "Mr. Horn," Davidson said as they approached. "Good to see you." Horn dismounted and walked up the porch steps. Rip and Flores stayed in their saddles. "Mr. Davidson, what can I do for you?" Davidson opened his portfolio and pulled out several sheets of paper. "The association has received complaints about cattle bearing questionable brands. We're conducting an investigation." "What kind of complaints?" "Reports of altered brands, missing cattle, suspicious sales." Davidson's voice was calm, matter of fact. "I'm sure you understand our concern." Horn took the papers and studied them. His face showed nothing, but his jaw tightened. "These are accusations against half the small ranchers in the county." "The association follows the evidence wherever it leads." "What evidence? I don't see any proof here, just names on a list." One of Davidson's men stepped forward. He was young, maybe 25, with pale eyes and a thin mustache. "Mr. Horn, the association's authority comes from the territorial legislature. We don't need proof to conduct an investigation." "That's so?" Horn handed the papers back. "Well, investigate away, but you'll do it without my help." Davidson stood up. That's unfortunate. The association values cooperation from legitimate ranchers. Are you saying the KC isn't legitimate? I'm saying cooperation is always appreciated. Davidson tucked the papers back into his portfolio. We'll be conducting our investigation regardless. I thought you might want to know. Horn crossed his arms. Obliged for the information. Davidson and his men walked to their horses. As they mounted up, the younger man looked at Rip. Haven't seen you around these parts before. Just hired on. Name? Rip felt the weight of the moment, the choice being offered. He could give a false name, keep his head down, avoid whatever was coming, or he could stand with the men who'd given him work and respect. Campbell. Rip Campbell. The man nodded as if filing the name away. Welcome to Johnson County, Mr. Campbell. The three riders left at an easy lope, their dust hanging in the still air long after they'd disappeared over the ridge. Well, Flores said, that was friendly. Horn spat into the dirt. Davidson's got his list. Question is what he plans to do with it. What kind of investigation? Rip asked. The kind that ends with rope or bullets. Horn looked toward the hills where Davidson's dust was fading. The association's tired of legal proceedings. Too slow, too uncertain. You think they'll move against the ranchers on that list? I think Davidson didn't come here to chat about the weather. Horn started toward the house. Better check our ammunition supply. Something tells me we're going to need it. The telegram arrived on Thursday morning while Rip was mending a section of fence line near the creek. Murphy rode out from the ranch house, the yellow paper folded in his shirt pocket. Horn wants to see you, Murphy said. Says it's important. Rip set down his hammer and walked back with Murphy, wondering what kind of trouble needed his attention. In his experience, telegrams rarely brought good news. Horn stood in the kitchen, the telegram spread on the wooden table beside his coffee cup. His face was grim. You know anyone in Cheyenne? Horn asked. No. Someone there knows you. Horn handed him the telegram. Rip read the message twice. The words were simple enough, but they made his stomach tighten. Texas regulators hired, stop 50 men coming north, stop watch yourself, stop Jack Morrison leading them, stop no signature, just a sender's name. Wells. Who's Wells? Horn asked. Man I knew during the war. Good man to have on your side. Rip folded the telegram. Who's Jack Morrison? Rip was quiet for a long moment. He thought of Morrison's laugh, the way he could put 3 bullets in a playing card at 50 yards, the scar on his left hand from a Yankee saber. We rode together in the Rangers after the war. Good man. Honest. Honest enough to hire his gun? Times get hard. A man does what he has to. Horn poured himself more coffee. This Morrison know you're here? Probably. Jack always was good at gathering information. He coming for you? Not for me personal, but if he's leading 50 men north, he's coming for the people on Davidson's list. Murphy leaned against the doorframe. 50 men. That's an army. That's the idea, Rip said. The association wants this finished quick and clean. Hire professionals, eliminate the problem, go back to business. And you know this Morrison. I know him. Rip walked to the window and looked out at the hills. Jack's not a killer for pleasure, but he'll do a job if the money's right and the cause seems just. Rustling cattle seem just to him? Depends on who's doing the talking when they hire him. A buckboard rattled into the yard, dust swirling around its wheels. Sarah McKenna sat on the driver's seat, her son beside her. She wore a blue dress and a bonnet that shadowed her face. Horn stepped out onto the porch. Mrs. McKenna, what brings you out this way? I was hoping to speak with Mr. Campbell. She looked around the yard until she spotted Rip in the doorway. If he has a moment. I'll be right there, Rip said. He walked out to the buckboard. Billy McKenna waved at him, and Rip touched the brim of his hat in response. Billy's been asking about those Texas stories, Sarah said. I was wondering if you might come to dinner Sunday. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and conversation. The invitation hung in the air between them. Rip was aware of Horn and Murphy watching from the porch, of the telegram folded in his pocket, of the way Sarah's eyes searched his face. That's kind of you, ma'am, but I'm not much for social occasions. It's not social. It's just dinner. She paused. Billy doesn't get to talk to many men besides the preacher and the banker. A boy needs to hear different kinds of stories. Mrs. McKenna, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. Why not? The question was simple, but it carried weight. Rip thought of Rachel, of the promises they'd made to each other, of the life they'd never have. Then he looked at Billy's eager face and Sarah's patient expression. Some stories aren't fit for children. Then tell the ones that are. Sarah gathered the reins. Sunday at noon, Mr. Campbell. Billy will be disappointed if you don't come. She turned the buckboard around and drove away, leaving Rip standing in the dust. Horn walked down from the porch. Nice woman. She is. Boy seems to like you. Boys like cowboys. It'll pass. Maybe. Or maybe you're what that family needs right now. Rip pulled the telegram from his pocket and read it again. 50 men coming north, led by someone who knew him well enough to predict his moves. What they need, he said, is for me to finish my business here and move on before Jack Morrison arrives. Horn studied him for a moment. You figure to run? I figure to be smart. Jack's got 50 men and association backing. What's smart about facing those odds? Depends on what you're fighting for, Horn said. He walked back toward the house, leaving Rip alone with his thoughts and the telegram that changed everything. The meeting was called for Friday night at the Occidental Hotel in Buffalo. Horn received the notice Thursday afternoon, delivered by a boy on a spotted pony who rode away without waiting for a reply. Says all ranch owners and foremen are expected to attend, Horn said, reading the paper. Discussion of mutual concerns regarding livestock theft. Expected, Murphy said. Not invited. Expected. The association's getting bold, Flores said. Horn folded the notice and put it in his vest pocket. Rip, you'll come with me. Murphy, you and Charlie stay here and keep an eye on things. The Occidental was the finest hotel in Buffalo, 3 stories of painted wood with glass windows and a dining room that served beef from china plates. When Horn and Rip arrived, buggies and saddle horses crowded the hitching rails. Light spilled from the hotel's windows onto the dusty street. The meeting was held in the hotel's main dining room. 30 men sat around tables pushed together to form a rough square. Davidson stood at the head, a stack of papers before him. Beside him sat a heavy-set man with a silver watch chain and the soft look of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. Gentlemen, Davidson said as conversations died away, thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet Mr. Wolcott from Cheyenne. He represents certain business interests that share our concerns about the rustling problem. Wolcott stood and nodded to the room. His suit was expensive, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Gentlemen, the territorial economy depends on legitimate cattle operations. We cannot allow theft to undermine honest enterprise. Rip recognized half the faces in the room. Some were big ranchers with spreads that ran thousands of head. Others were smaller operators, men who worked their own cattle and knew every animal by sight. The division was clear in how they sat, who they talked to, where their eyes went when Davidson spoke. The situation has reached a critical point, Davidson continued. We have documented evidence of widespread rustling activities, names, dates, specific instances of theft. A man at the far end of the table raised his hand. Rip recognized him as Peters, the homesteader who'd sold Horn the steer with the altered brand. What kind of evidence? Peters asked. Davidson shuffled through his papers. Cattle bearing suspicious brands, sales that cannot be properly documented, animals found on ranges where they don't belong. That describes half the cattle in Wyoming, said another voice. Brands fade, cattle drift, always have. Perhaps in the past, Wolcott said, but we cannot allow tradition to excuse criminal activity. The association has legal authority to investigate these matters. What kind of authority? Horn asked. Davidson smiled. The territorial legislature has granted the association broad powers to protect legitimate ranching interests. We can deputize men, conduct investigations, make arrests. And who decides what's legitimate? Peters asked. The association, of course, based on established criteria. Such as? Membership in the association, proper documentation of cattle ownership, cooperation with our investigations. Rip watched the faces around the room. Some men nodded agreement. Others looked skeptical. A few seemed afraid. An older rancher named Sullivan leaned forward. Davidson, you're talking about taking the law into your own hands. I'm talking about enforcing the law when regular authorities prove inadequate, Davidson replied. Sheriff Angus has been unable to address the rustling problem. The association will do what's necessary. And if we disagree with your methods? Sullivan asked. Wolcott answered. Then you'd better examine your own operations carefully. Make sure everything is in order. The threat was polite but clear. Horn shifted in his chair, his hand resting near his gun belt. Gentlemen, Davidson said, the association doesn't seek conflict. We seek justice, but we will have it, one way or another. He picked up his papers. Those of you with legitimate operations have nothing to fear. Those who've been taking liberties with other men's cattle should consider this fair warning. The meeting broke up with men filing out in small groups, their conversations hushed. Horn and Rip walked to their horses in silence. Well, Horn said as they mounted up, now we know where we stand. Where's that? Outside the association, which means outside the law, according to them. They rode out of town under a sky thick with stars. Behind them, lights still burned in the hotel windows where Davidson and his supporters continued their discussions. You figure they'll move soon? Rip asked. Soon enough. Davidson's got his authority, his list of targets, and 50 hired guns coming from Texas. Horn spurred his horse into a trot. Question is whether we'll be ready for them. Sunday came clear and warm, with a breeze that carried the scent of sage across the valley. Rip spent the morning working on his gear, cleaning his rifle and checking his ammunition supply. The telegram about Morrison's approach had made him careful about such things. At 11:30, he saddled the bay and rode toward Sarah McKenna's place. Her spread lay 5 miles east of the KC Ranch, a small operation with maybe 200 head and a house that needed paint. But the corrals were well built, and the barn showed signs of good maintenance. Billy McKenna ran out to meet him as he rode into the yard. You came? Ma wasn't sure you would. I said I'd be here. Rip dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. She's been cooking all morning, made an apple pie and everything. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She wore a yellow dress that brought out the color in her hair. Mr. Campbell, I'm glad you could make it. Ma'am. He touched his hat brim. The house was small but clean, with furniture that had seen better days but was well cared for. A photograph on the mantel showed a man in a suit standing beside a younger Sarah. Her husband, Rip figured. The man had kind eyes and work-roughened hands. Billy, help me get the food on the table, Sarah said. They ate pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the meat tender enough to cut with a fork. Billy chattered about school and fishing and his plans to become a cowboy when he grew up. Sarah mostly listened, though her eyes stayed on Rip's face as if reading something there. Tell me about Texas, Billy said when they'd finished the main course. Is it really big as they say? Bigger, Rip said. Takes a man 3 days to ride across some ranches. 3 days? How many cattle would a ranch like that run? Depends on the grass and water. Maybe 50,000 head. Billy's eyes went wide. 50,000. That's more cattle than people in all of Wyoming Territory. Might be, Rip said. I never counted the people. Sarah brought out the apple pie, still warm from the oven. The crust was golden brown and flaky, the kind of pie that made a man think of home and family. "This is fine pie, ma'am," Rip said. "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me to make it when I was Billy's age." Sarah cut herself a smaller slice. "Do you have family back in Texas, Mr. Campbell?" The question caught him like a punch to the stomach. For a moment he saw Rachel's face, heard her laugh, remembered the weight of her hand in his. "Not anymore," he said. Something in his voice must have warned her off because she changed the subject. "Billy, why don't you show Mr. Campbell your fishing hole while I clean up?" The boy led him down to the creek that ran behind the house. The water was clear and cold, with deep pools where trout might hide. Billy showed him the spot where he'd caught a 2-pound rainbow the week before, describing the fight with the enthusiasm only a 10-year-old could muster. When they returned to the house, Sarah was sitting on the porch steps, her apron folded in her lap. Billy ran inside to look at a book, leaving them alone. "He likes you," she said. "He's a good boy. He needs a man's influence. The preacher tries, but he's not—" She paused, searching for words. "He's not the kind of man Billy needs to learn from." Rip sat on the porch rail, facing her. "What kind is that?" "The kind who's seen the world, who knows how to handle trouble when it comes." She looked out at the hills. "Trouble's coming, isn't it? I can feel it in the air, like a storm building." "Might be." The association meeting Friday night. Tom Horn looked grim when he rode back through town. "You know Horn well?" "Well enough. He's an honest man trying to do right in a situation where there may not be a right answer." She turned to look at him. "Like you, I think. I'm just passing through, Mrs. McKenna." "Are you? Because it seems to me you're putting down roots whether you mean to or not." Billy came back outside, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But as the afternoon wore on, Rip found himself watching Sarah's hands as she gestured, listening to her laugh, noticing the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. When the sun started getting low, he knew it was time to leave. "Thank you for dinner," he said, standing to go. "It was the best meal I've had since I left Texas." "You're welcome any time," Sarah said. "Billy would like that. So would I." She walked him to his horse. Billy had gone inside to tend to his chores, leaving them alone again. "Mr. Campbell," she said as he swung into the saddle, "I know you're carrying some kind of hurt. I can see it in your eyes. But hurt doesn't have to be the end of living. Some hurts go pretty deep." "I know they do. But they don't have to go so deep they drown everything else." She stepped back from his horse. "Think about that, will you?" Rip rode back toward the KC ranch as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Behind him, lamplight glowed in Sarah McKenna's windows. Ahead lay whatever trouble Jack Morrison and his 50 men would bring. But for the first time since Rachel's death, he found himself thinking about something other than the past. "Heard it from a freighter just in from Cheyenne," Charlie Flores said, dismounting by the cookhouse. The smell of frying bacon and coffee hung in the evening air. "Said they crossed paths with 50 men, maybe more, all armed for bear and riding hard." Tom Horn stopped with a fork halfway to his mouth. 50? Riding in a column, military style," Flores went on. He wiped dust from his face with a bandana. "Said the man in the lead looked like Jack Morrison." Rip felt the bacon turn to lead in his stomach. He kept his eyes on his plate. "Freighter said he recognized a few others riding with him," Flores said. "Men with reputations. A fella named Caleb Vance, another they called Duke McCall." Ben Murphy looked at Rip. "You know these men?" Rip pushed a piece of bacon around with his fork. "Vance rode with the Rangers," he said. "Good man when things get hot." He took a sip of coffee. "McCall rode with Quantrill's outfit. The kind of man who likes his work." The memory was clear. McCall's face lit by a burning farmhouse, a smile under his mustache. "So we got professionals coming," Horn said. It wasn't a question. Some good, some bad. "All of them deadly," Rip said. Horn pushed his plate away. The food was forgotten. "Murphy, you and Charlie round up every box of cartridges we got. I want to count. Rifles and sidearms." "You figure they're coming here?" Murphy asked, a little too eager. "They're coming for everyone on Davidson's list," Horn said, "and our name is on it." Later, the smell of gun oil filled the bunkhouse. Light from a single lantern cast long shadows on the walls. Rip worked a clean rag through the barrel of his Winchester, the steel cool and smooth under his fingers. He pulled the lever, listened to the slick, solid sound of the action. Click-clack. He worked it again. Murphy sat on the next bunk, a whetstone in his hand, drawing the blade of a Bowie knife across it with a soft shh. 50 men, he said to the blade. "That's long odds." "Odds are for gamblers," Rip said. He held the rifle up, sighting down the barrel at the lantern flame. "What are they for us?" "They're just what's in front of you." Flores came in, carrying 3 rifles. He laid them on an empty bunk. "The Spencer's got a cracked stock and the old Sharps is missing a firing pin." "So we got what we're holding and not much else," Horn said from the doorway. He looked from man to man, his face a mask in the lantern light. "We'll post a guard. 2-hour shifts, sundown to sunup." He looked at Rip. "You know what to watch for." Rip nodded, feeding a cartridge into the Winchester's loading gate. The brass felt warm. "I know." The sun bled out behind the hills, painting the clouds orange and purple. The wind turned cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Horn stood with Rip by the corral, looking out at the darkness gathering in the valley. The horses shifted and snorted behind them. "High ground," Horn said, pointing with his chin toward a cluster of rocks that overlooked the creek road. "You can see a rider coming a mile off, even in moonlight. Yell twice if you see anything." Rip pulled his hat down. "I'll do that." He walked away from the light of the ranch house, the Winchester balanced in his right hand. The crunch of his boots on the dry ground was the only sound. "He was in my store an hour ago," Henderson said. The mercantile owner twisted the brim of his hat in his hands, his knuckles white. "One of Davidson's men. Bought 2 pounds of arbuckles and a sack of flour. Paid with a Cheyenne banknote." Horn poured the man a cup of coffee. Henderson's hand shook when he took it. "What man, Henderson?" "Called himself Wolcott's clerk. A young fella with ink on his fingers. Left his satchel on the counter." Henderson took a long swallow of coffee, his eyes darting toward the windows of the ranch house kitchen. "It wasn't latched proper. A sheaf of papers fell out." Rip leaned against the doorframe, watching. He'd seen scared men before. Henderson was the kind who could get himself killed for seeing something he shouldn't. "I helped him gather them," Henderson continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He was flustered. Didn't notice one sheet slid under a bolt of canvas." "And you read it," Horn said. Henderson nodded. "I wish to God I hadn't." He set the cup down on the table with a clatter. It was a list. Headed Priorities for County Stabilization. Rip pushed himself off the doorframe. "What kind of list?" "Names," Henderson said, looking at Rip. "Ranchers, homesteaders, about 20 of them. Each one had a notation next to it." "What kind of notation?" Horn asked, his voice flat. "A dollar amount." Henderson swallowed hard. "And a word. Capture or disperse or eliminate." The kitchen went quiet. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. "Who was on it?" Rip asked. "Nate Champion," Henderson said. "His name was at the top. Next to it, it said eliminate, $1,000. Rip thought of the face on the wanted poster Horn had shown him. An honest face, Horn had said. "Nick Ray, who works for him. Same thing, 500. Henderson's eyes found Horn's. I saw your name, Tom, down near the bottom. It said, disperse. That's generous of them, Horn said without a trace of humor. And next to the KC Ranch, Henderson added, his gaze shifting to Rip, someone had penciled in a name, Campbell, with a question mark. So Jack Morrison had been talking. He was making this personal. Rip felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This ain't about law enforcement, Henderson said, standing up, eager to leave. The back of the sheet had dispositions, talked about a main force and 2 flanking columns, said they'd sweep north from the Tisdale Ranch, said they'd establish a deadline at the Powder River. It's an invasion, Mr. Horn. They're coming to clean out the whole county. You did right to come tell us, Horn said, walking him to the door. I just want to sell my goods and be left alone, Henderson said, not looking back. But a man can't sell to dead customers. He untied his buggy, climbed in, and whipped his horse into a run, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Horn came back inside and poured himself another coffee. His hand was steady. He looked at Rip. An invasion. That's how Jack would plan it, Rip said. He was a captain in the Rangers, thinks in terms of campaigns, not fistfights. He'll hit the small places on the edge first, the ones who can't fight back or run, sow fear. Then he'll move on the bigger targets. Like Nate Champion. Champion's first on the list. He's alone out there at the KC cabin. They'll make an example of him. Horn walked over to a pine chest in the corner of the kitchen. He lifted the lid and pulled out a rolled-up piece of oilcloth. He spread it on the table, weighting the corners with coffee cups. It was a hand-drawn map of Johnson County, showing the creeks, the hills, the ranches marked in black ink. Davidson's got his list, Horn said, his finger tracing a line in the dust on the map's surface, and Morrison's got his battle plan. He looked up at Rip, his eyes hard as flint. Question is, what have we got? Rip stared at the map, at the black ink dot that marked Champion's cabin on the Powder River. It sat alone, miles from any neighbor. An easy target. He picked up a burnt matchstick from a saucer on the table. He laid it across the dot. A coffin on a map. Horn tapped a spot southeast of Champion's place. The Bar C is here, Sullivan spread. He spoke up at the meeting. He might help. He tapped another spot. Sarah McKenna's place is here. Too close. He looked at Rip. They'll hit Champion first. He's a symbol. Rip dragged the matchstick from Champion's cabin toward the KC Ranch marker. A slow, deliberate scrape across the oilcloth. After the symbol, he said, they'll come for the soldiers. You need to take your boy and go to Buffalo, Rip said. He didn't look at Sarah, just kept checking the cinch on the bay's saddle. Stay in the hotel until this is over. Sarah McKenna stood by the porch rail of the KC Ranch house, a canvas sack of supplies at her feet. She had ridden over at dusk, unannounced. And when will that be, Mr. Campbell? When it's done. He pulled the leather strap tight. The horse grunted. I brought bandages. Carbolic acid. What was left of my husband's laudanum. She nudged the sack with the toe of her boot. I thought you might need them. We might. He finally turned to face her. In the fading light, her face was drawn with worry. Which is why you shouldn't be here. Tom Horn won't run, she said. And you won't leave him. I know that much about you. You don't know much about me. I know you showed up when I was starting to think there were no decent men left. I know my son watches you like you hung the moon. She took a step closer, her voice dropping. And I know I haven't slept a full night since Henderson told me what he saw on that list. Rip took a step back, putting space between them. The air was cool and smelled of horses and coming rain. Worrying about this isn't your job. Then whose is it? She asked, her voice sharp with a frustration that went beyond the coming fight. Rip, there's a reason I came here tonight, and it wasn't just to bring bandages. He waited. He knew what was coming. He could see it in the set of her jaw, in the way she held her hands clasped in front of her. I have a good spread, she said, the words coming in a rush. It's small, but the water's reliable and the grass is strong. It needs a man's hand. Billy needs a man to show him things. She looked straight at him, her eyes searching his. I'm asking you to ride away. Not to run. To ride with us. Come back with me now. We can be gone before they get here. He saw the whole picture she was painting. A life. Pot roast on Sundays, fixing fences, watching a boy grow up. A quiet life, the kind he'd once planned with Rachel. The memory of it was a physical pain, a hot poker in his gut. Sarah, he said, his voice rough. Don't. Why not? She pressed. Is it so wrong to want to build something? To want a life instead of a war? The man who could give you that life, Rip said, the words tasting like ash. I buried him in a canvas sheet on the banks of the Platte River. What's left of me isn't fit for you or your boy. Her face fell, not in anger, but in a deep, weary sadness. She had seen the truth in his eyes. She nodded slowly, a small, defeated gesture. I'm sorry, she whispered. For your wife. And for... I'm sorry. She understood. He could see it. She was hurt, but she understood the geography of his grief. It was a country she couldn't enter. Before either of them could say another word, the sound of a horse pounding hard cut through the evening quiet. A single rider, coming from the south, not sparing his mount. Ben Murphy burst into the yard, his horse slick with sweat and foam, its sides heaving. He pulled up short, sliding in the dirt. Tom! He yelled. They're on the move! Horn came out of the house, a rifle in his hand. Flores was right behind him. Saw 'em from the bluffs near Tisdale's, Murphy said, breathing hard. The whole damned army. They're making for the middle fork of the Powder River, moving fast. How many? Horn asked, his voice calm. 50, maybe more. And they ain't riding like a posse. Murphy looked at Rip, his eyes wide. They're riding like cavalry. The moment between Rip and Sarah was gone, erased by the news. The personal hurt was swallowed by a larger, more immediate threat. War was no longer coming. It was here. Rip turned from Sarah without another word. He met Tom Horn's gaze over the back of his saddle. He pulled the Winchester from its scabbard. Keep that column tight, the man in the lead said, his voice carrying in the crisp morning air without him having to raise it. This isn't a county fair parade. The man riding next to him, younger, with a new colt strapped to his hip, shifted in his saddle. They know we're here, Mr. Morrison? Jack Morrison didn't look at him. His eyes scanned the ridgeline to the east, a habit learned over 20 years of riding through country that wanted him dead. They know somebody's here. They don't know who we are or what we can do. That's the part that matters. He wore a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat, nothing to catch the eye. But he sat his horse with an authority the other 50 men understood. Behind him rode Caleb Vance, his face a road map of old fights, his Winchester resting easy across his lap. On the other flank was Duke McCall, humming a tuneless song, his eyes bright with the kind of enjoyment a wolf feels just before the chase. They were the lieutenants, the rest were the fist. From a half-mile away, behind a screen of juniper and rock, Rip Campbell rested his field glasses on the column. He lay flat on his stomach, the cold of the ground seeping through his shirt. Tom Horn lay beside him, a Sharp's rifle cradled in his arms. That's a disciplined outfit, Horn said, his breath fogging in the air. No stragglers. They ride like they've done it before. They have. Rip adjusted the focus on the glasses, the brass warm from his hands. The lead rider came into sharp relief. The way he sat his horse, the angle of his hat, the set of his shoulders. It was all the same. The man out front is Jack Morrison. Horn was quiet for a moment. The one from the telegram? The same. Rip swung the glasses to the man on Morrison's left. The one next to him with the scar on his cheek is Caleb Vance. He's careful, thinks before he shoots. He moved the glasses to the other side of the column. The one humming, that's Duke McCall. He shoots before he thinks. Friends of yours? I knew them. The words were clipped. He and Jack had tracked Comanches across the Staked Plain for 2 years, shared the last of their water from the same canteen. He'd seen Vance hold off 3 men in a Laredo cantina with an empty pistol. He'd seen McCall burn a village for the fun of it. The war had made them all, just in different ways. Below, the column halted beside a creek. Morrison gave a series of hand signals. Men dismounted, loosened cinches, filled canteens. There were no fires. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was more threatening than 100 yelling men. They were professionals here to do a job. As if he could feel their eyes on him, Jack Morrison lifted his own pair of field glasses and scanned the ridge where they lay. The movement was slow, deliberate. He wasn't searching. He was looking. Rip didn't move a muscle. The sun glinted off Morrison's lenses. The glasses stopped, pointed directly at him. "He's found us," Horn said, his voice a low rumble. Rip didn't answer. He held the glasses steady, looking across the distance at a man who was once his friend. He could almost feel the weight of Morrison's gaze, the silent acknowledgement. "So you're here. I figured you would be." Morrison lowered his glasses. He didn't raise a hand in greeting or a rifle in threat. He just watched for a long moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat. It wasn't a wave. It was a salute. A sign of professional respect between 2 men who knew the rules of the game they were about to play. Rip lowered his own glasses. The unspoken challenge hung in the air between the ridge and the creek. "You know what I'm here to do. Now, what are you going to do about it?" "He knows you," Horn said. "He knows I'm here." Morrison turned in his saddle. He looked at Vance and McCall, then pointed. Not at the ridge where Rip and Horn lay watching. He pointed north, up the winding path of the Powder River, toward the lonely spot on Horn's map where Nate Champion's cabin sat, isolated and unaware. Rip watched as the column mounted up, the quiet efficiency returning. They formed their lines and began to move, not toward the KC ranch, but toward the first name on their list. Horn pushed himself back from the ledge. "They're going for Champion." Rip was already on his feet, sliding down the shale toward their horses. "That's how it starts." The smoke was a thin gray finger pointing at the sky from behind the eastern hills. Charlie Flores saw it first from the roof of the barn where he was patching shingles. "Rider coming!" he yelled down. "And he's in a hurry!" It was one of Sullivan's men from the Bar C. He rode into the yard on a lathered horse, his face smudged with soot. "It's the Peters place," he gasped, pointing back the way he'd come. "We saw the smoke at dawn." Horn met him on the porch steps, Rip right behind him. "Are they alive?" "Don't know. We didn't get close. Saw riders circling the place, a dozen of them. Figured it was better to fetch you than get shot." "You did right." Horn turned. "Rip! Murphy, let's go!" They rode hard, the 3 of them, cutting across the open range. The smell of burnt pine and scorched earth reached them a mile out. When they topped the last rise, the homestead lay below them in a shallow bowl of land. The cabin was a black skeleton, its roof gone, smoke still curling from the charred logs like lazy ghosts. The barn and the corrals were untouched. "That's Morrison's work," Rip said, reining in. "He's sending a message." "What message?" Murphy asked, his hand tight on the butt of his pistol. "The fire is for your home, not your livelihood," Rip said. "Your cattle are fine. Just leave. It's a business transaction." They rode down slowly. The silence was wrong. There were no chickens scratching in the dirt, no dog barking a warning. The front door of the cabin had been kicked from its leather hinges and lay in the yard. Rip dismounted and walked the perimeter. The ground told the story. The tracks of at least 20 shod horses, a chaotic pattern where they had surrounded the house. Then, the deep ruts of a single farm wagon, wheels churning the soft earth as it pulled away in a desperate hurry. He followed the ruts a few yards and saw a small set of footprints alongside them, a child's trying to keep up. "They're alive," he called to Horn. "They loaded up and ran." Horn kicked at a piece of smoldering timber. His face was granite. Ran where? East, Rip said. Toward the Nebraska line. They won't be back. Murphy walked through the wreckage. A cast-iron stove lay on its side. A pot of what might have been beans spilled across the floorboards. Chairs were overturned, a straw mattress torn open. In the corner, a small wooden rocking horse lay on its side, one of its rockers splintered. Murphy nudged it with his boot, then stopped. He bent down and picked something up from the ashes, a small tin cup with painted flowers on it, now blackened and dented. "They just let him do this?" he said, his voice thick with anger. He threw the cup. It clattered against the stone chimney, the only part of the house still standing whole. "Who was going to stop them?" Rip said. He was looking at the horse tracks again. "This wasn't a fight. It was an eviction." "This is Johnson County," Horn said, walking out of the ruin, wiping black soot from his hands onto his trousers. "We have a sheriff." "Angus?" Murphy spat. "He's probably in Buffalo, polishing the badge Davidson bought him." "Maybe," Horn said. "But the law is the law until it proves it isn't. People need to see that. They need to know what happened here today." Rip looked from the ruined homestead to the tracks leading east, a family erased from the map. He thought of Henderson's list. Disperse. This is what it looked like. Clean, efficient. No bodies to complicate things. Just fear, packed in a wagon and sent down the road. The invasion had begun, not with a bang, but with a quiet, suffocating fire. Horn swung into his saddle. He didn't look back at the smoking ruin. His eyes were fixed on the west, toward town. "We're riding to Buffalo," he said. "Let's go ask Sheriff Angus what he plans to do about his county." "This is an official proceeding, not a street corner argument," Sheriff Angus said, banging a gavel on his oak desk. The sound was flat in the crowded courthouse. The room was hot and smelled of sweat, damp wool, and stale tobacco. "I'll have order." Tom Horn stood in the open space before the desk, his hat in his hands. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The Peters family is gone, Sheriff. Their home is a pile of ash. That ain't an argument, it's a fact." Rip stood by the back wall with Murphy and Flores. He watched the faces in the crowd. Storekeepers, blacksmiths, ranchers from the small spreads. Men who looked at their boots when Horn spoke, then glanced toward the front row where Davidson sat with two of his men, looking calm and bored. "I've dispatched a deputy to investigate the incident," Angus said, puffing out his chest. His badge was polished so bright it caught the light from the tall windows. "A full report will be filed in due course." "In due course?" a voice called out from the crowd. It was Sullivan, the old rancher from the Bar C. "By the time your deputy gets his boots on, there'll be other incidents, Angus. We all know what this is." Davidson rose smoothly to his feet. He held a leather-bound folio, tapping it lightly against his palm. "What this is, Mr. Sullivan, is a matter of law. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association is a deputized body. We have been tasked by the territorial government to secure the county against theft." "Peters wasn't a thief," Sullivan shot back. "His name appears on multiple affidavits concerning the movement of unbranded stock," Davidson said, his voice like oiled machinery. "It's entirely possible he had a dispute with his associates, or that he fled the county to avoid prosecution. To suggest otherwise without evidence is slander." He let the word hang in the hot air. Slander. A word that could get a man sued, a word that carried weight with the townspeople. Rip saw Henderson, the mercantile owner, shrink back in his seat. Horn stepped forward again. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, fire-blackened tin cup. He set it on the edge of the sheriff's desk. The painted flowers were barely visible under the soot. "This belonged to Peters's daughter," Horn said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "She left it behind. Ask your deputy to include it in his report." Sheriff Angus stared at the cup as if it were a coiled snake. The room was silent. The choice was laid bare on the sheriff's desk. It was a child's cup against a rich man's folio of affidavits. Rip saw the calculation in the sheriff's eyes, the quick, fearful glance toward Davidson. Angus cleared his throat. He pushed the cup to the side with his finger. "Evidence will be properly logged," he said, not looking at Horn. "This meeting is adjourned." The gavel banged again. Men started to shuffle out, not meeting each other's eyes. They had their answer. The law had chosen its side. Rip watched them go, then turned to leave. A hand on his arm stopped him. It was Sarah McKenna. Her son, Billy, stood beside her, clutching her skirt. She pulled him out into the dusty street, away from the dispersing crowd. "You saw that," she said, her voice low and urgent. "He pushed the cup away. That's their answer to everything." "It's the answer we expected," Rip said. "Then why stay?" Her eyes pleaded with him, all her earlier resolve gone, replaced by a raw fear. "There is no law here for men like you and Tom. They have the money, the government, the guns. You have a handful of cowboys and a sense of duty that will get you killed." He looked past her, down the street toward the swinging doors of the Occidental Saloon. Two of Davidson's men were heading inside, laughing about something. "Please, Rip," she whispered, the first time she had used his given name. "Leave. Take your pay and ride out. Let them have this damned county. It's not worth your life." He looked down at her, then at the boy who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. He thought of the wagon tracks leading east from the Peters place and the small set of footprints beside them. He thought of his own wife, of promises he couldn't keep. "I took the man's wages, Sarah," he said. It was the only explanation he had, the only one that made sense in his world. An obligation was a line you didn't cross. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was both a greeting and a goodbye. He turned away from her, leaving her and the boy standing in the afternoon sun. He didn't head back toward the ranch. He walked down the street and pushed through the swinging doors of the Occidental. "I figured I'd find you in here," a voice said. Rip didn't turn from his place at the bar. He watched the man's reflection in the murky mirror behind the rows of bottles. Jack Morrison looked the same. A little more gray at the temples, a few more lines around his eyes, but the same confident set to his shoulders. He put a silver dollar on the bar. "Rye for my friend," Morrison said to the bartender, "and one for me." The bartender slid a glass of amber liquid next to Rip's. Morrison picked up his own and leaned against the bar, an easy 2 feet of space between them. In the mirror, Rip saw Caleb Vance take a seat at a table by the window, watching the street. Duke McCall was at the far end of the bar, rolling a cigarette, his back to the wall. "It's been a while, Rip." 5 years, Rip said to the mirror. "Fort Worth." "That's right. You were heading to Mexico, last I heard." Morrison took a drink. "Wyoming's a long way from Mexico." "I got turned around." Rip finally turned his head to look at the man. "Saw your work this morning out at the Peters place. You've gotten neat." Morrison's expression didn't change. He studied the whiskey in his glass. "The contract specified dispersal. The family was dispersed. The property was neutralized. It was a clean operation." "That's what you call it? An operation?" "It's a job, Rip. Same as chasing rustlers for the state of Texas was a job." He looked at Rip directly now, his eyes steady. "A piece of paper with names and dollar amounts. My part is to make sure the terms are met. You, of all people, should understand that." "I understand a contract," Rip said, keeping his voice low. "I don't recall one that ever paid a bounty on a child's tin cup." A flicker of something, annoyance maybe, crossed Morrison's face before it was gone. "The situation here is complicated. These people on the list aren't the simple homesteaders they pretend to be. They're part of an organized ring. We have affidavits, proof." "The kind of proof money can buy," Rip said. "I saw Davidson's man in court. He talks a good game." "He's a businessman. I'm a soldier. We have a common goal." Morrison finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a soft click. Your name came up, you know. When they were drawing up the contract, I told them you were a drifter, just passing through." He paused. "I told them you wouldn't pick a side in a local squabble. Looks like I might have been wrong. I took a man's wages, I'm earning them. Tom Horn's a fool. He's trying to fight a war of politics with a range war mentality. He's going to get himself and every man with him killed." Morrison leaned in a little, his voice dropping. "This isn't like the old days. This isn't about honor. It's about progress. The big outfits are the future. These little spreads, they're the past. You're on the wrong side of history, Rip." "History's written by the winners," Rip said. "The fight's not over yet." Morrison straightened up. The conversation was over. They both knew it. They had laid out their positions. Friends once, now chess pieces on opposite sides of a board. "I have a list, Rip. A work order. Nate Champion's name is at the top. We'll be paying him a visit in the next day or two." He laid his hands flat on the bar. "Don't be there. Don't be anywhere near the places we have to go, for the sake of those miles we rode together." "My name's on that list, Jack." "With a question mark," Morrison said. "I put it there. A reminder to talk to you first." He pushed himself off the bar. "Don't make me have to erase it." He turned and walked toward the door. Vance got up from his table and fell in behind him. McCall flicked his cigarette into a spittoon and followed, giving Rip a long, unblinking stare as he passed. Rip didn't watch them go. He stared at his untouched whiskey, the one his old friend had bought him. He thought of the salute on the ridgeline, the professional courtesy. This was the next step, the formal warning. He knew what came after that. He picked up the glass. "The main house is a coffin," Rip said, kicking a loose board on the porch. "Too many windows. A man can't watch his back and watch a window at the same time." Tom Horn stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the last of the daylight fade. "The bunkhouse? Worse. A long box with a door at each end. They'd pin you down and shoot through the walls for sport." Rip pointed with his chin toward the big barn that sat on a slight rise 100 yards from the house. "That's the place, solid timbers, a hayloft with clear sight lines to the creek and the west ridge. One big door you can barricade." Ben Murphy came out of the cookhouse, carrying 2 sacks of flour slung over his shoulder. He grunted with the effort. "Where do you want these, Rip?" "In the barn. Against the back wall. We'll need the water barrels, too." Horn watched Murphy trudge toward the barn, then looked at Rip. "They're listening to you. They're smart enough to know a ranger captain's tactics when they see them," Rip said. "Jack Morrison will try to surround us, cut us off. He'll expect us to hole up in the house. It's the civilian thing to do. And you're not a civilian. Not today." Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and dry wood. Rip directed Flores and Murphy, his voice low and calm. They used ropes and pulleys to haul sacks of grain and barrels of water up into the hayloft. They knocked out chinking between the logs at chest height, creating rifle ports that covered all approaches. "Don't make them too neat," Rip said, running his hand over a freshly made hole. "A perfect square draws the eye. Make it look like the wood just rotted out." Horn came in, carrying 2 lanterns and a box of cartridges. "I make it 300 rounds for the rifles and maybe 50 for each pistol. After that, we're throwing rocks." "It'll have to be enough," Rip said. He looked at the 4 of them, shadows in the growing dark. 4 men against 50. "We need to send a rider." "Angus won't do a thing," Murphy said, spitting on the dirt floor. "Not to the sheriff," Horn said. He looked at Charlie Flores, who was leaning on a pitchfork, listening. "Charlie, you're the best rider and you've got the fastest horse. I want you to go to the bar C. Find Sullivan. Tell him Morrison's on the move and he's hitting the KC. Tell him we're making a stand." "What if he won't come?" Flores asked. "Then you ride to the next spread. And the next. Tell them what Henderson saw on that list. Tell them their name is on it too, whether it's written down or not." Horn put a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Don't ask them to ride here. Just tell them to raise enough hell that the army has to get involved. Light fires, send telegrams to the governor, Make noise. And if they catch me, then you tell them nothing, Horn said, his voice hard. You understand? Flores nodded, his jaw set. I understand. An hour later, they stood in the darkness by the corral. Flores was mounted on a sleek black mare, a rifle in his scabbard, and a canteen on his saddle horn. He carried no bedroll. He was traveling light and fast. Stay off the main roads, Rip told him. Follow the creeks where you can. The sound of the water will cover the noise of your horse. Godspeed, Charlie, Horn said, slapping the mare's flank. Flores didn't look back. He nudged the horse into a silent walk, leading her down into the darkness of the creek bed. The other three stood by the fence, listening. They heard the soft splash as the mare entered the water, then nothing. Rip turned and looked back at the barn, a dark shape against a field of stars. Every window in the ranch house was dark. It looked deserted, a perfect trap. He pulled his pistol, checked the load, and slid it back into its holster. They're here, Ben Murphy said from his post at a crack in the hayloft wall. His voice was a harsh whisper in the gray light of dawn. Rip didn't need to look. He could feel it. The silence was too deep. The birds in the cottonwoods by the creek had stopped singing. He moved to his own rifle port, the rough wood cool against his cheek. They weren't hiding. 50 men spread out in a loose crescent, using the creek bed, the rocks, and a shallow depression in the earth for cover. They had moved into position in the dark with the quiet discipline of ghosts. He saw the glint of a rifle barrel from the rocks overlooking the main house. He saw the shape of a man's hat behind the trunk of a cottonwood. That's a textbook siege line, Rip said, his voice flat. He's got every approach covered. He left the back clear. So we can run? Murphy asked, a hopeful note in his voice. So he can shoot us in the back when we do, Tom Horn said from the other side of the loft. He had his big Sharps rifle resting on a sack of oats. As the sun cleared the eastern ridge, a single rider broke from the line at the creek. He held a piece of white cloth tied to his rifle barrel. He rode a tall gray gelding and didn't hurry. Hold your fire, Horn said. Though Murphy was already sighting down his barrel, the rider stopped 100 yards out, a clear target. He was a silhouette against the rising sun. It's Vance, Rip said. Jack sent his best man. Horn! Caleb Vance's voice was calm and clear. My employer, Mr. Morrison, presents his compliments. He asks for the surrender of yourself and the man known as Rip Campbell. You're to lay down your arms and come out. The other man is free to go. Murphy spat on the floor. The other man's name is Ben Murphy, you son of a bitch, he yelled through the wall. Vance didn't react. He sat his horse, waiting. What's your answer, Tom? Rip asked, not taking his eyes off the figure in the distance. Horn leaned his cheek against the stock of his Sharps. Tell Mr. Morrison, he called out, his voice a low bull's roar, that the KC Ranch is not for sale today, and neither are its men. Vance sat for a moment longer, as if memorizing the words. He nodded once, a small formal gesture. Then he turned his horse and began to ride back at the same deliberate pace. Now? Murphy asked, his finger tight on the trigger. Let him get back to his line, Rip said. There are rules to this. They burned a man's house down. That was business. This is a fight. They watched Vance disappear back into the creek bed. The silence returned, heavier this time. Rip counted to 10, then 20. The sun was fully up now, throwing long shadows across the yard. A single rifle cracked from the rocks. The shot wasn't aimed at the barn. It hit the metal rooster on the roof of the main house with a loud ping, spinning it around. A signal. Before the sound had faded, the world dissolved into a roar of repeating rifles. Bullets hammered into the thick timbers of the barn, a deafening drumbeat. Wood splintered. A bullet punched through the wall a foot from Murphy's head, spraying him with slivers of pine. He cursed and fired back, a wild shot that went nowhere. Don't waste it, Horn yelled over the noise. Pick a target! Rip didn't fire. He watched the muzzle flashes, mapping their positions. They were good. They changed location after every few shots, never giving him a stationary target. He saw a man with a sharps of his own trying to crawl to a better position behind a water trough. The man was exposed for no more than 3 seconds. Rip settled his sights, led him by a foot, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder. He didn't see the bullet hit, but the man behind the trough scrambled back into the creek bed, dragging one leg behind him. The fusillade from the regulators faltered for a moment. They had seen it too. A message sent and received. The firing started again, but it was more sporadic now. Less of a wild volley, more of a patient, probing search for a weakness. Rip ejected the spent cartridge. The brass casing made a small metallic tink as it hit the wooden floor of the loft. The sun was a hot weight in a hazy sky. Dust kicked up by the bullets hung in the still air, mixing with the sharp smell of burnt gunpowder. Hours had passed. The initial roar had settled into a patient rhythm of single shots. A sniper's game. "He's using a spotter," Rip said, wiping sweat from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He hadn't moved from his post in an hour. "See the flash from that window in the main house? That's not a rifle. It's a looking glass. He's signaling targets." From across the loft, Horn grunted. "Smart." "It's what Jack would do," Rip said. "Save ammunition. Make every shot count." A bullet slammed into the log just above Rip's head. He didn't flinch. He just noted the angle. It came from the cottonwoods. He scanned the trees, looking for a shadow that was out of place, a patch of darkness that was too solid. He saw it. A piece of a man's coat, barely visible in a fork between 2 thick branches. Before he could line up his shot, another rifle cracked from the far side of the creek. It was Duke McCall. He was firing fast, trying to draw their attention, giving the man in the tree a clear shot, a classic diversion. "Murphy, keep McCall busy," Rip said without turning. "With pleasure," Murphy growled. His rifle boomed, then again. Rip ignored the exchange. He put his sights on the fork in the tree. He waited. The man in the tree, confident in McCall's cover fire, leaned out just an inch to aim. It was all Rip needed. He squeezed the trigger. He didn't hear a yell, but a rifle tumbled from the high branches, clattering down through the leaves. A moment later, a body followed. A limp sack that hit the ground with a soft thud. The shooting from McCall's position stopped. "One down," Murphy said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. 49 to go, Horn said. "Don't get cocky." The afternoon wore on. The heat in the loft became suffocating. The water in their canteens was warm and tasted of tin. The regulators tried a new tactic. A coordinated volley at a single section of the barn wall, hoping to punch a hole through the thick timbers. The wood groaned and splintered, but held. "They're getting impatient," Rip said. "So am I," Murphy muttered. "I'm sick of this waiting." He crawled to a wider gap between 2 logs, a place where a wagon tongue was once mounted. "I can get a better angle on that creek bed from here." "Stay put, Ben," Horn ordered. But Murphy was already there, shoving his rifle through the gap. "I can see 3 of them, lined up like ducks in a—" The shot was so close it was like a thunderclap inside the barn. Murphy cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, and fell backward, clutching his shoulder. His rifle slid to the floor. Blood seeped between his fingers, a dark stain spreading across the dusty blue of his shirt. Horn was across the loft in 3 strides. He ripped Murphy's shirt open. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder. Bad, but not fatal if he didn't bleed out. "Damn it," Murphy hissed through clenched teeth as Horn pressed a wadded-up bandana against the wound. "Damn it all." Rip laid down a covering fire. 3 quick shots aimed at the muzzle flash that had hit Murphy. He saw a man dive for better cover. He knew who it was. The shot was too good, too quick. It was Morrison himself. From his new position, Jack Morrison was partially visible behind a weathered buckboard that had been left in the yard. He had moved up while they were focused on McCall. Rip levered a fresh round into the chamber. He settled the rifle stock against his cheek, took a slow breath, and lined up the shot. It wasn't about hitting the man. It was about hitting the buckboard, a foot from the man's head. It was a conversation. He fired. The bullet struck the buckboard's iron-rimmed wheel with a high, angry scream of ricocheting lead. From behind the wagon, a pistol shot answered immediately. The bullet whined past Rip's rifle port and buried itself in the hay behind him. The message was clear. I'm still here. The sun began to dip toward the western ridge, painting the dust-filled air a bloody orange. The shooting tapered off as the light failed. Rip leaned back against the rough wall, the Winchester heavy across his lap. He slid a hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of loose cartridges. He began to line them up on the floor beside him. 1, 2, 3. Each one a choice. Each one a life. He had 17 left. "Horn!" The voice came out of the darkness, conversational, unhurried. "You in there, Tom?" No one answered. In the suffocating blackness of the hayloft, the only sounds were Ben Murphy's ragged breathing and the scuttling of a mouse in the hay. "It's Jack Morrison. I've got a proposition for you." The voice moved, coming from the direction of the creek now. "Your man Murphy. He took a bad hit. He's going to get a fever in this heat. You send him out. We'll see he gets to the doctor in Buffalo. My word on it." Murphy stirred on the pile of burlap sacks where he lay. "Go to hell, Morrison," he rasped, his voice weak but full of venom. The voice from the dark ignored him. "Think about it, Horn. This isn't your fight. You're a hired man. You can walk away clean. Davidson wants the rustlers, not you." Rip stayed at his post, his Winchester across his knees. He could see the faint orange glow of a small fire the regulators had built in the shelter of the creek bed. Just big enough to boil coffee. Cocky. "And you, Rip!" The voice was closer now. Morrison was walking the perimeter, just out of pistol range. "I know you're in there. This has got nothing to do with you. You were always a lone wolf. There's a good horse and a clear road south waiting for you. No questions asked." Rip thought of the 5 years since he'd last seen Jack. 5 years of drifting, of trying to outrun a ghost on the open prairie. He looked across the dark space at Horn, a solid shadow against the slightly less dark wall. Horn hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. He was listening, weighing the poison in the offer. "The offer's good till sunup," Morrison called. "After that, we're coming through that door, and we won't be bringing a doctor." The voice faded. The silence it left behind was worse. It was filled with the things that hadn't been said. The smell of Murphy's blood was thick in the hot, still air. Rip closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about Morrison or the coming dawn. Sarah McKenna's face floated in the darkness behind his eyelids. The worry in her eyes when she'd asked him to leave with her, the strength in her hands. He remembered the simple weight of the dinner plate she'd handed him, the warmth of the apple pie, the sound of her boy's laughter. A whole life offered up like a cup of cool water. A life he'd turned away from because he was still tethered to a grave. He had told himself it was about duty, about earning his wages. But sitting here in the dark, waiting to die, that reason felt thin as paper. He wasn't just fighting for Horn's wages. He was fighting because it was easier than facing the silence that came after, easier than trying to build something new on top of ashes. He wondered if she was in Buffalo, if she'd taken Billy and gone to the hotel like he'd said. He pictured her looking out a window into this same night, wondering if he was still alive. He felt a hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the fight. It was the sudden, sharp-edged realization that he wanted to see her again, not just to know she was safe, but to see her. He had been so busy guarding the past, he hadn't realized he'd started to care about a future, and now he'd likely have neither. A low groan came from the corner. "Water," Murphy whispered. Rip crawled over, uncorked his canteen, and lifted the wounded man's head. Murphy drank greedily, then fell back, his face slick with sweat in the faint starlight filtering through the rifle ports. "We ain't gonna make it, are we?" Murphy asked, his voice a boy's. Before Rip could answer, Tom Horn moved. He didn't speak. He picked up his big Sharps rifle, the one that sounded like a cannon. He walked to the main door, braced the rifle against the heavy timber, and pointed it up at the night sky. He pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't a shot aimed at an enemy. It was an answer, a full stop. The final word in the night's conversation. Hear that? The sound was a soft, rhythmic scrape from the back of the barn near the foundation. It wasn't a sound an animal would make. It was deliberate. Rip moved like a shadow across the loft, signaling for Horn to stay with Murphy. He dropped soundlessly to the main floor and crept toward the rear wall, pistol in his hand. The scraping stopped. He pressed his ear against the rough timber. Silence. Then 3 soft taps. A signal. "Who's there?" Rip's voice was a low rasp, barely disturbing the dust motes in the air. A pause. Then a woman's voice, a desperate whisper. "It's Sarah McKenna. Let me in." His mind reeled. It was impossible. Morrison would have sentries posted on every approach. He moved to a small wooden slide that covered a grain chute near the floor. He lifted it an inch. An eye stared back at him from the darkness. "Are you alone?" he whispered. "No. Henderson is with me." Rip slid the cover open. Sarah McKenna crawled through the narrow opening, dragging a heavy burlap sack behind her. She was covered in mud, her dress torn at the hem, a long scratch on her cheek. The mercantile owner scrambled in after her, his face pale with terror, his Sunday suit ruined. He was carrying a wooden crate that looked heavy. "Are you insane?" Rip hissed, pulling them into the deeper shadows. "They'll kill you for this." "They have to see you first," Sarah said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pushed the sack toward him. It clinked with the sound of metal on metal. "We came up the creek, on our bellies the last 100 yards. Henderson set the crate down with a groan. "She said it was our duty," he whispered, wringing his hands. "Said we couldn't let the law be what Mr. Davidson says it is." Rip looked from the terrified storekeeper to the woman standing before him. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and she had the look of a wild thing, fierce and exhausted. He knelt and opened the sack. Boxes of cartridges, Winchester, 44-40s. He pulled one out. It felt heavy and solid in his hand. Hope had a weight. "How many?" "4 boxes," she said. "It was all he had under the counter. There's laudanum for your man, bandages, a bottle of whiskey." Rip stared at her. Not at the supplies, but at her. At the mud on her face and the determined set of her jaw. She hadn't just sent help. She had crawled through the dark, through a ring of hired killers, to bring it herself. He saw the raw, scraped skin on her hands where she'd pulled herself over rocks in the creek bed. He had spent years running from a woman's ghost, a memory of love that was fragile and perfect. But this woman, kneeling in the dirt and smelling of mud and gunpowder, was not fragile. She was a fighter. As much of a fighter as any man in Morrison's crew. In that moment, watching her push a stray strand of hair from her face with a muddy hand, the grief that had been his constant companion for 5 years felt distant. It was no longer a weight drowning him, but an old scar that had finally stopped aching. He stood up and reached out, not for the ammunition, but for her. He put a hand on her arm, his fingers closing over the worn fabric of her sleeve. It was a clumsy, unpracticed gesture, a gesture he hadn't made in a very long time. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. The name felt right in his mouth. Her eyes met his in the dark. She gave a small, tired nod. "We have to go," Henderson whispered urgently, his eyes darting toward the rifle ports. "The sky's getting gray." Rip helped her back to the grain chute. "Go the same way you came. Don't stop till you're a mile clear." She crawled to the opening, then paused and looked back at him. "There's coffee and bacon in the sack," she said. "A man fights better on a full stomach." Then she was gone, a shadow disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom. Rip slid the wooden cover back into place. He picked up the heavy sack of ammunition and the crate. He turned and saw Tom Horn at the top of the ladder, watching him, his face unreadable in the dark. Rip started up the ladder, the weight of the cartridges a solid, reassuring burden. Dawn was coming, but for the first time in a long time he felt ready for it. "That coffee smells good," Tom Horn said from the top of the ladder. Rip didn't look up from the small fire he'd made in a tin bucket, shielded by sacks of grain. The aroma of Sarah's coffee was the first decent thing he'd smelled in 2 days. "There's bacon, too." "He said he'd get me a doctor." The voice came from the corner, weak and feverish. Ben Murphy was trying to push himself up on one elbow. His face was pale and slick with sweat in the lantern light. "You lie still, Ben," Horn said, starting down the ladder. "You'll tear that wound open again." "Morrison gave his word," Murphy insisted, his eyes wild. "He said the offer was good. He'd let you and Rip go. He just wants the list." Rip stopped feeding twigs into the fire. He looked at Horn, who was now standing on the main floor, his face a mask of stone. "What are you talking about, son?" Horn's voice was dangerously quiet. "We're going to die here," Murphy said, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "You heard the shooting. They ain't playing. He said I could walk out. He'd get me to a doctor. All I had to do—" "All you had to do was what?" Rip asked, his hand moving to the hilt of the Bowie knife on his belt. Murphy's eyes darted from Rip to Horn and back again. The fear of the siege had been replaced by the more immediate fear of the 2 men in the barn with him. "Just open the door when he gives the signal." The coffee boiled over, hissing on the hot metal of the bucket. Horn took a step toward the wounded man. "You were going to sell us out, Ben, for a promise from a man who burns families out of their homes?" "He's a professional," Murphy whimpered. "He gave his word." "His word is worth the powder it would take to blow it to hell," Horn said, his voice full of a cold, weary disgust. "You've been a fool." "I don't want to die in here," Murphy suddenly screamed, a raw, ragged sound. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face contorted in pain and panic. Before Horn could move, Murphy lunged, not for a weapon, but for the main door. He stumbled, half falling, and clawed at the heavy timber bar that secured it. "Ben, no!" Horn yelled. Rip moved. He crossed the 10 feet of open floor in 3 silent strides. He didn't draw his pistol. A shot would be the signal Murphy was trying to give. He hit Murphy low and hard, a shoulder driving into the man's legs. They went down together in a heap, the impact sending a jolt of fire up Murphy's wounded arm. He screamed again, a high, thin sound of pure agony. He rolled, lashing out with his good arm, his fingers scrabbling for anything, a rock, a loose piece of wood. Rip saw the glint of steel. Murphy had a skinning knife tucked in his boot. The blade was short but sharp. He slashed wildly, tearing a rip in the sleeve of Rip's coat. They were on the dirt floor, a tangle of limbs in the dim lantern light. Rip grabbed Murphy's wrist, twisting it. The wounded man was surprisingly strong, fueled by terror. The knife blade hovered inches from Rip's face. He could smell the fever on Murphy's breath, a sour, metallic odor. Rip slammed Murphy's wrist against the hard-packed earth. The knife clattered free. He didn't hesitate. He drove his own Bowie knife up and under Murphy's ribs, a single brutal thrust. Murphy's body went rigid. A soft, wet gasp escaped his lips. The fight went out of him all at once. His eyes, wide with surprise, stared up at the hayloft, at nothing. Rip pulled back, breathing hard. Silence filled the barn. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the hiss of the forgotten coffee. He stood up. Horn hadn't moved. He was staring at the body of the boy he'd hired, the boy he'd tried to protect. The trust that had held the 3 of them together in the dark was gone, lying dead on the floor between them. From outside, a new sound began. Not gunfire, a rhythmic, heavy thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of men with axes, methodically striking the base of the thick cottonwood tree that stood 30 yards from the barn door. "The tree is down!" Jack Morrison's voice was a ragged tear in the pre-dawn quiet. There was no negotiation in it now, just the exhaustion of a foreman whose job was taking too long. "Sun up, we're coming through that door. Throw the guns out first, then walk out with your hands on your heads. It's the only deal you're getting." Inside the barn, Rip finished loading the last of Sarah's cartridges into his Winchester. The brass felt cool and final in his hands. He and Horn were all that was left. Murphy's body lay under a horse blanket in the corner, a silent testament to a bad decision. "He sounds tired," Rip said. Tom Horn stood at a rifle port, peering into the gray gloom. He didn't answer. He had been quiet ever since they dragged Murphy's body out of the way. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt floor. "Well?" Rip asked. "What's the answer?" Horn didn't yell back. He didn't waste a word. He lifted the big sharps, settled the stock against his shoulder, and fired into the darkness where the voice had come from. The boom of the .50 caliber rifle was a physical blow inside the barn, a roar that shook the dust from the rafters. It was a full stop. It was the only answer they had left. In the ringing silence that followed, Rip knew the time for talking was over for good. The next sound they heard would be the start of the final push. He walked over to the corner where Sarah had left the supply sack. He rummaged through it, past the whiskey and the laudanum, and pulled out the small bag of Arbuckle's coffee. He tore a corner off the thick paper sack. He found a pencil stub in his coat pocket, worn down to the nub. He sat with his back against a grain sack, the lantern casting a small, flickering circle of light around him. "Writing your last will and testament?" Horn asked, his back still to him. "Something like that," Rip said. His hand, calloused and stiff from the rifle, felt clumsy holding the small pencil. He smoothed the paper on his knee. The letters were thick and awkward. He wrote Sarah, then stopped. What did a man say? He thought of her face, mud-streaked and fierce in the dark. He thought of her asking him to leave. He thought of the life she offered. He started again. "You asked me why I stayed. It wasn't for the wages. I think I had to see if I was still the kind of man who would." He paused, the pencil lead gritty against the paper. "The world needs more people like you and your boy. Tell him the stories yourself. You know the right ones." He signed it, simply, R. Campbell. He folded the rough paper into a small square, the crease sharp and definite. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, the one that wasn't torn. It rested against his ribs, a small secret weight. He had made his peace. He stood up and went to the pile of weapons. He took Murphy's rifle and propped it in a firing port on the far side of the loft. He did the same with an old Spencer, making it look like they had more men than they did. A ranger's trick, a ghost army. He and Horn gathered the remaining ammunition, piling the loose cartridges and the last 2 boxes from Sarah on a crate between their positions. 2 men, maybe 50 rounds each. Horn finally turned from the wall. He picked up his pistol, spun the cylinder, checked the load by feel. His movements were slow, deliberate. He looked at Rip, his eyes deep-set shadows in the lantern light. "It's been a good fight, Campbell." "It's not over yet," Rip said. "It's always a good fight," Horn corrected him. The first hint of true daylight was a pale gray line under the barn door. The air grew still. Then came a new sound, a single sharp whistle from the creek bed. It was answered by another from the rocks. Then the sound of movement. Not the stealthy creep of a siege, but the deliberate heavy tread of dozens of boots on dry ground. The metallic click-clack of rifle levers working fresh rounds into chambers. They were coming. Rip raised his Winchester, the stock smooth and familiar against his cheek. He thumbed the hammer back. The sound was loud as a hammer blow in the waiting silence. The world outside the barn door exploded. It wasn't 1 shot or 10, but a single deafening roar as every regulator fired at once. The volley wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to blind. Bullets tore through the rifle ports, chewing the wood to splinters, forcing Rip and Horn to duck down as the air filled with a storm of lead and pine. Through the thunder, a new sound, the splintering crash of axes against the main door. "They're coming!" Horn yelled, grabbing his pistol. The heavy timber bar groaned, then cracked. With a final violent crash, half the door blew inward, torn from its iron hinges. Bright, dust-choked sunlight flooded the barn, silhouetting the half-dozen men who poured through the opening. They came in low and fast, spreading out. A man on the left raised his rifle toward the loft, and Horn-S big sharps boomed once, a deafening blast of smoke and thunder. The man was thrown backward out the door as if he'd been kicked by a mule. Rip fired the Winchester twice from the top of the ladder, dropping a second man before a shotgun blast from the doorway tore rungs out from under him. He dropped the last 10 feet, landing hard, the rifle flying from his hands. He rolled behind a horse stall, drawing his Colt as another regulator charged him, a long-barreled pistol leading the way. Rip fired from the ground. The man grunted, staggered, and fell across the stall door, his dead eyes staring at the rafters. The barn was a whirlwind of close-quarters chaos. Gunsmoke and dust made the air thick as stew. Horn, his sharps empty, was using a pitchfork like a spear, keeping 2 men at bay near the water barrels. He roared like a cornered bear, a primal sound of fury. Then, through the swirling smoke, Rip saw him. Jack Morrison was standing just inside the door, a pistol in each hand, directing his men with calm, deadly precision. He wasn't rushing. He was managing the fight. He saw Rip at the same moment. The other men seemed to fade away. The noise of the fight receded to a dull roar. It was just the two of them. Rip fired. Morrison moved, not away, but to the side, using a thick support beam for cover. The bullet tore a chunk of wood from the beam where his head had been. Morrison returned fire, a single, deliberate shot. The bullet tugged at Rip's sleeve, a hot kiss of lead. Rip moved, circling behind the stalls. He could hear Morrison's boots on the hard-packed earth, a hunter's quiet tread. This wasn't a brawl anymore. It was a stalk. Rip peered through a gap between 2 boards. Morrison was gone. A floorboard creaked above him. Rip threw himself sideways as a pistol blasted from the hayloft. Morrison had used the chaos to get up the ladder. The bullet dug a furrow in the dirt where Rip had been. Rip fired upward through the floor of the loft. He heard a curse, the sound of a pistol clattering on the boards. He had hit him. He scrambled up the ladder, his own pistol held tight. Morrison was there, leaning against a hay bale, blood dripping from his left arm. His other hand was empty. His pistol lay a few feet away. Rip raised his Colt. "It's over, Jack." "The job's not done," Morrison said through clenched teeth. He didn't look at his arm. He looked at Rip, and then he lunged, not for his gun, but for Rip. They crashed together, falling from the loft in a tangle of limbs, landing hard on the dirt floor below. The impact knocked the wind out of Rip, his pistol flying from his grasp. Morrison was on top of him, his good hand reaching for the Bowie knife on Rip's belt. Rip grabbed his wrist. They strained face to face, the cords in their necks standing out. Morrison was strong, his grip like iron. The knife was slowly, inexorably coming free of its sheath. Then, a sound cut through the air. It was thin and high and utterly alien, distant but sharp as glass. A bugle call, clear and military. It wasn't a call to charge. It was a regulation U.S. Army field call. Both men froze. The desperate struggle for the knife stopped. Morrison's eyes, inches from Rip's, lost their focus on the kill. They were filled with a sudden, shocked confusion. The bugle sounded again, closer this time. The bugle call echoed, impossibly clean, against the dirty chaos of the barn. Morrison's grip on Rip's wrist went slack. The murderous intent in his eyes was replaced by a look of pure, professional shock. He knew that sound. It wasn't the ragged call of a volunteer militia. It was the U.S. Army. Outside, the sporadic shooting stopped. A man yelled a question, then was cut off. From the barn doorway, one of the regulators stared out, his jaw hanging open. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. A new sound rolled over them, the rhythmic drumming of 100 hooves moving at a disciplined trot, the jingle of sabers and harness. It was the sound of order arriving in a place where there had been none. Rip shoved Morrison off him. They both scrambled for their pistols, not to fight each other but out of pure instinct. They stood, breathing hard, listening as the cavalry troop fanned out, surrounding the entire ranch yard. A man in a dusty but perfectly tailored blue uniform rode his bay charger to the shattered barn door. He had a major's oak leaves on his shoulders and a neat brown mustache. He didn't look at the carnage inside. He addressed the stunned regulators scattered around the yard. "I am Major Theron," he announced, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Of the 6th United States Cavalry. By order of the President, this county is hereby placed under federal jurisdiction. You will all lay down your arms, now!" From behind the cover of the creek bed, a man in a fine city suit stood up. Rip recognized Wolcott, the man from Cheyenne. "Major, there must be some mistake," Wolcott called out, trying to sound reasonable. "We are a legal posse, deputized by the Johnson County authorities and acting under the full authority of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association." Major Theron turned his horse to face him. He looked down at Wolcott as if he were an interesting species of insect. "Sir, your legal posse has sent telegraphs flying all the way to Washington. The governor has declared a state of insurrection. I am not here to debate territorial law. I am here to end a small war." He drew his saber. The polished steel hissed from its scabbard. "Sergeant!" A burly sergeant with a thick neck and a corporal's chevron on his sleeve rode forward. "Sir, have your men collect their weapons. Anyone who resists is to be treated as a hostile combatant." The regulators looked at each other, then at Morrison, who had walked slowly to the barn door. His face was pale under the dust and grime. He saw the blue-coated troopers dismounting, forming a skirmish line, their carbines held at the ready. He saw the Gatling gun being unlimbered from a pack mule. He was a professional. He knew what a massacre looked like. "You heard him," Morrison said, his voice flat and empty. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dirt. "It's over." One by one, with curses and sullen glares, the hired guns from Texas dropped their rifles and pistols into a growing pile in the center of the yard. They were no longer an army of regulators. They were just men with dirty hands, suddenly on the wrong side of a much bigger gun. Rip and Horn stood in the shadows of the barn, watching. The fight had been taken from them. They had won, but they hadn't. The cavalry hadn't arrived to save them. They had arrived to stop the noise. Major Theron dismounted and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on spent shell casings. He glanced at the bodies, his face impassive. He looked at Horn's blood-spattered shirt, at Rip's torn coat, at their exhausted, smoke-stained faces. "Are you Mr. Horn?" he asked, his voice crisp. "I am," Horn said. "My orders are to take all armed parties into custody pending a federal investigation." The major looked around the wrecked barn. "You and your man will be confined to your bunkhouse. A guard will be posted, for your own protection, of course." The sun was fully up now, shining on the blue uniforms, the polished brass, the neatly stacked rifles of the captured regulators. The raw, desperate violence of the siege was over. A colder, more complicated reality was settling in. Charlie Flores's ride had worked better than any of them could have imagined. It hadn't just brought help. It had brought a whole new set of rules. "They're calling it a misunderstanding," Sullivan said. He paced the narrow space between the bunks, his boots stirring up dust. The cavalry trooper at the door watched him without interest. "They're holding them at the fort, not the county jail. Giving them army rations. Wolcott's got 2 lawyers down from Cheyenne already talking about overzealous law enforcement." Tom Horn sat on his bunk, cleaning a pistol the major had allowed him to keep. He didn't look up. "They're not prisoners, Sullivan. They're an inconvenience, an embarrassment. You don't put an embarrassment in a jail cell. You put it in a comfortable room until the problem goes away." Rip leaned against the wall by the window, watching the neat, orderly bustle of the cavalry camp that had sprung up in the yard. Troopers were currying horses, cleaning carbines. The pile of captured regulator weapons was gone, carted away in an army wagon. It was as if the siege had been a bad dream they were tidying up after. "But Nate Champion is dead," Sullivan insisted, his voice cracking with frustration. "We rode out there yesterday. Found him and Nick Ray in the cabin. They shot the place to pieces. How is that a misunderstanding?" "It's a misunderstanding because Mr. Wolcott's business partners in Omaha and Chicago say it is," Horn said, snapping the cylinder of his pistol back into place. "Those men out there," he jerked his chin toward the temporary stockade where the regulators were being held. "They're just employees. The men who signed the checks are the ones who matter, and they're 100 miles away, writing more checks to more lawyers." Rip thought of his time as a ranger. He'd brought in men who had done far less than Morrison's crew and seen them hang before the sun went down. He'd also seen men who owned 10,000 head of cattle get away with murder on the word of a single, well-paid witness. He'd thought justice was a straight line then, a clear shot. He'd been young. "The law's a funny thing," Rip said, his voice quiet. The other two men stopped to look at him. "Down in Texas, the brand inspectors from the big outfits could seize any cattle they said had a blotched brand. Didn't need a sheriff. Their word was law. The man who lost the cattle had to go to court to prove they were his. By the time he got a court date, the cattle were already sold in Kansas." He pushed himself off the wall. "This ain't new. It's just got a different accent." The victory felt like ashes in his mouth. They had held the barn. They had survived. But the war wasn't going to be won with rifles. It was being fought now in telegrams and back rooms by men in clean suits who would never hear a shot fired. The bunkhouse door opened and Major Theron stepped inside, ducking his head under the low frame. His uniform was immaculate. He looked from Horn to Sullivan, then his eyes settled on Rip. "The prisoners are being transported," the major said, his voice crisp and official. "A special train is waiting in Cheyenne. They'll be taken to Fort Russell to await trial." "A trial they'll never see," Horn muttered. The major ignored him. "One of the men, a Mr. Jack Morrison, has made a formal request. He wishes to have a word with you, Mr. Campbell, before he departs." Theron's face was unreadable. "He says you have unfinished business." Rip met the major's gaze. Outside, a sergeant began calling out names. The regulators were being formed up into a column. He could hear the jingle of chains. "I'll see him," Rip said. They met in a canvas army tent pitched in the middle of the yard, halfway between the bunkhouse and the stockade. A corporal with a rifle stood at the flap, his shadow long in the afternoon sun. Two armed troopers had escorted Rip from the bunkhouse, a formality that felt like a mockery. Inside, Jack Morrison sat on a wooden crate, his left arm in a clean white sling. He wore manacles on his wrists, the chain resting in his lap. A U.S. Army field desk and another crate were the only other furniture. A tin cup of water sat on the desk, untouched. "Major Theron's a stickler for the rules," Morrison said, his voice flat. He gestured with his cuffed hands toward the empty crate. "Have a seat." Rip didn't sit. He stood by the tent flap, his arms crossed. "You wanted to see me." "I did." Morrison looked down at his manacled hands, then back up at Rip. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "This wasn't how I saw it ending." "It's not over," Rip said. "The lawyers are already here." "The lawyers aren't for me," Morrison said, "or for Vance or McCall. We're the hired help. They'll pay us our fee and cut us loose when the time is right. The lawyers are here to make sure none of the mud splashes back on the men who own the cattle." He shifted on the crate, the chains making a soft, dry rattle. "You ever meet Wolcott?" "Saw him at the hotel meeting." "He's a type," Morrison said. "He reads a balance sheet like a preacher reads the Bible. We weren't a posse to him. We were an expense line on a ledger, meant to solve a problem. The cavalry showing up just complicated the accounting." He looked at his bandaged arm. "That was a good shot. Through the floorboards." "You were in the way," Rip said. "I always am." Morrison leaned forward, his eyes finding Rip's. "I need to know one thing. That rider you sent out. Flores. How did he get through my lines?" "He went where you weren't looking," Rip said. "Down the creek. In the water." Morrison nodded slowly, a professional acknowledging a clever move. "I should have thought of that. I was so focused on the roads, on the frontal assault. I forgot what you taught me back in the territories." "What was that?" "You said an army thinks in lines, a ranger thinks in circles." He looked around the small tent. "I got paid to think in lines." The silence stretched between them, filled with the ghosts of shared campfires and old fights. "The question mark next to your name on the list," Rip said. "Was that your work?" "It was," Morrison admitted. "I told them you were no homesteader. I told them you were a professional, and you wouldn't get involved unless someone made you. I was hoping you'd be smart enough to take your pay and ride on before we got here." He sighed, a sound of pure weariness. "But you always did have a damned stubborn streak when it came to earning your wages." A sergeant appeared at the tent flap. "Time's up." Morrison pushed himself to his feet. He stood before Rip, the chains hanging between them. He started to extend his good hand, then stopped, looking down at the manacles as if seeing them for the first time. He let his hand drop. "We were good once, you and I," he said. "We were," Rip agreed. "This business." Morrison shook his head. "It's for men like Wolcott now. There's no room for soldiers anymore, just bookkeepers with guns." He turned and walked out of the tent without looking back. Rip watched him go, a straight-backed figure in chains, joining the column of other captured men. He was just another piece being moved off the board. Rip stood alone in the empty tent. He reached into his coat, his fingers brushing against the folded piece of paper he'd written for Sarah. He pulled out the tin cup of water from the desk and drank it down in one long swallow. It was warm and tasted of metal, but it was wet. He set the cup down and walked out into the sunlight, leaving the tent and whatever was left of his old life behind him. He was in the bunkhouse, sitting on the edge of his cot when she came in. The cavalry trooper at the door looked like he wanted to stop her, then thought better of it. Sarah McKenna carried a small wooden box. She set it on the empty bunk next to him. "Tom told me what happened," she said. "He said you had a disagreement with Mr. Morrison." Rip was shirtless, dabbing at a long, raw scrape on his forearm with a damp rag. The fight had left him with a dozen bruises that were already turning a dark purple. "Something like that." "I brought some of my husband's things." She opened the box. Inside were clean linen bandages, a bottle of dark brown iodine, and a small flask. "This is for the outside." She tapped the iodine. "And this," she tapped the flask, "is for the inside." He stopped his clumsy dabbing and watched her. She took the rag from him, uncorked the iodine, and began to clean the scrape with practiced, gentle movements. The sting was sharp, but he didn't pull away. Her hands were steady. "The cavalry is packing up the regulators' camp," she said, her eyes on her work. "Major Theron says they'll be gone by morning." "Good. Then the soldiers will go, and the reporters who've shown up in Buffalo. Then it will just be us again." She finished cleaning the wound and began wrapping it with a strip of clean linen. Her knuckles brushed his skin. "The town's calling you and Tom heroes." "The town has a short memory," Rip said. "A month from now, they'll just be glad it's quiet." She tied off the bandage with a neat, firm knot. She didn't move away. She was close enough that he could see the small flecks of gold in her brown eyes, smell the faint scent of soap and sage from her clothes. "I need a foreman, Rip." The words were quiet, a simple statement of fact. "My fences are a wreck, and I've got 200 head of cattle that need to be rounded up before the first snow. Billy's a good boy, but he can't do it alone." "Good." He finally looked at her, really looked at her. "You can hire a man in Buffalo, someone who knows the range." "I don't want a man from Buffalo." She held his gaze, her own unwavering. "I don't want someone who knows the range. I want you." He felt the words like a physical blow. He pulled his arm back, breaking the contact between them. He stood up and walked to the other side of the bunkhouse, putting the cold iron stove between them. "Sarah, don't." "Why not?" she asked, her voice steady, refusing to let him retreat. "Is it so wrong to want to build a life out of what's left after a fire?" "It's not your fire," he said, his voice rough. "It's mine." He thought of the piece of paper in his pocket, the letter he'd written to her, a ghost's last words. The words he couldn't say now, face to face. Her name was Rachel, he said, the name feeling strange and heavy in the small room. He hadn't said it aloud to another person in 5 years. "She died on the trail coming out here. I made her promises, about a place in Oregon, about a life." He turned to face her, the raw truth of it laid bare in his eyes. "When I'm with you, when I look at you, I feel like I'm breaking every one of them. It wouldn't be fair. Not to you. I'd just be a shadow in your house." She listened, her expression unchanging. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. When he was finished, a long silence filled the room. "A person can't live in a graveyard, Rip," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Even for love." She picked up the flask from the wooden box and set it on the bunk where he'd been sitting. "The offer stands," she said, "for the job. The rest is just a hurt that needs tending, like any other." She turned and walked out, leaving him alone with the smell of iodine and the weight of a choice he didn't know how to make. "Where you headed?" Tom Horn asked. He was sitting on the porch steps, watching the last of the cavalry wagons disappear down the road. "For a walk," Rip said. He didn't take a rifle, just walked away from the ranch house, past the bullet-scarred barn, and followed the creek as it wound its way through the cottonwoods. The water ran clear over smooth gray stones. He stopped at the spot where he'd first ridden into the valley, where he'd first seen Hartwell and his man, a lifetime ago. He sat on the bank, the late afternoon sun warm on his back. "A person can't live in a graveyard." Sarah's words. They had followed him from the bunkhouse, quiet and persistent. He closed his eyes. He wasn't in Wyoming anymore. He was on the banks of the Sweetwater the night before the fever took hold. The air was cold and thin. Rachel was huddled next to him, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring into their small cook fire. "It will have a green door," she'd said, her voice full of a certainty he'd lost long ago. "And windows big enough to let the whole afternoon in. We'll plant a garden with climbing roses right by the porch." "Roses have thorns," he'd said, playing their game. "So do I," she'd answered, her laugh like the sound of this creek. "It's how you know they're real." He opened his eyes. The creek was still there. The sun was still warm. The memory was so clear it was a physical ache in his chest. For 5 years he had guarded that memory, kept it polished and perfect, like a photograph in a locket. But the woman in the memory wasn't a ghost. She was vibrant and alive, full of plans for a life with green doors and rose bushes. The man she'd loved wasn't the man sitting on this creek bank. That man had been full of his own plans. This man had just been waiting. He had made a shrine out of his grief, a monument not to her life, but to his own failure to keep her alive. He had been honoring the debt, not the woman. "It's how you know they're real." Sarah McKenna was real. Her hands were calloused from work. Her face was lined with worry. Her offer wasn't a dream of a place in Oregon. It was a simple, complicated job. Fences to mend, cattle to find, a boy who needed a man to show him things. He reached into his coat pocket. His fingers found the folded square of rough paper. The letter. He pulled it out and looked at the clumsy, penciled letters. A letter from a dead man. A goodbye. He hadn't been writing to Sarah. He had been writing to Rachel, a final report from a life he was ready to abandon. He thought of Rachel's face, not pale with fever, but laughing by the fire. Would she want this? This hollow man who walked away from a good woman because he was afraid of letting a new memory stand beside hers. Her ghost wasn't the one holding him here. He was. He wasn't betraying Rachel by wanting to live. He was betraying her by choosing not to. He had been dancing with a ghost, and the dance was over. He didn't tear the letter up. He didn't throw it in the creek. That was a gesture for a different kind of man, a man who made big, dramatic moves. He just folded it again, carefully, and tucked it deep into another pocket. A different pocket. It was a part of his history, not his future. He stood up. He scanned the creek bed until he found what he was looking for, a flat, smooth stone, the size of his palm. He hefted it, feeling its cool, solid weight. He drew his arm back, a low, smooth motion, and snapped his wrist. The stone skipped across the surface of the water, once, twice, 5 times, leaving a trail of widening rings that shimmered in the sun before they vanished. "I figure you owe me for a month's work," Rip said, "minus whatever you paid for that shirt I ruined." Tom Horn was sitting at the kitchen table, a ledger book open in front of him, a pen in his hand. He was making a list of what the siege had cost him. He looked up, his eyes tired. "The job's not done. There's rebuilding to do." "The job I was hired for is," Rip said. "I signed on to push cattle. The shooting was extra." He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He hadn't come in and sat down. Horn put the pen down. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in the quiet kitchen. "She made you an offer, a good one from what I hear." "She did," Rip said. "It's a foreman's job. I'm a cowhand. Came north to earn traveling money for a ride back to Texas." "That what this is? A ride back to Texas?" Horn's gaze was steady, cutting. "Or a ride away from here?" Rip thought about the creek, about the stone skipping across the water. He thought about the letter in his pocket. "When I rode into this valley, I had a plan. Work, save, ride south. The plan got complicated, but it's still the plan. Plans change." "Some do," Rip agreed. "Some you have to see through. A man needs to finish one trail before he starts on another." He met Horn's look. "It wouldn't be right, to her or the boy, to start a job you don't know if you can finish." Horn studied him for a long moment, reading the lines on his face. He saw something there that wasn't running. It was resolve. He nodded slowly, a sign of understanding between two men who knew what it was to be tied to a path. "All right," he said. He pushed the ledger aside and pulled a small, locked cash box from a drawer. He opened it with a key from his vest pocket. Inside were neat stacks of bills and coins. He counted out $40 in greenbacks and silver. 30 a month, standard wages, and 10 for the extra. He pushed the money across the table. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a stake. It was the price of a clean break. Rip stepped forward and picked up the bills and coins. The paper was crisp, the silver heavy in his palm. It was the wages he had come for, the reason he had stayed. It felt both heavier and lighter than he'd expected. "The horse is sound," Horn said, closing the cash box. "The bay. He's a good mount. He'll get you where you're going." "He will," Rip said. He put the money in his pocket. The transaction was done. "I'll be needing a bill of sale for him. in case anyone asks. I'll write one up. Horn picked up his pen again, but didn't dip it in the inkwell. He looked at the kitchen door, toward the path that led out of the valley. You'll be telling her yourself, I suppose. I will, Rip said. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, the silver coins making a soft, final jingle in his pocket. He rode up to her place in the high morning sun. His bedroll was tied neatly behind his saddle, his canteen was full, and the bay gelding moved with the steady, ground-eating walk of a horse starting a long journey. Sarah was on the porch, splitting kindling with a small hatchet. She stopped when she saw him, setting the hatchet down on the top step. She didn't look surprised. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited. Rip dismounted and tied the bay to the rail, though the horse wouldn't have strayed. He walked to the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat. Your horse is packed for a long ride, she said. It wasn't a question. Texas is a long ride, he answered. She looked past him at the wide, empty country that stretched south. Tom paid you then? He did. Rip turned his hat over in his hands, studying the sweat-stained brim. I told him I was a cowhand, not a foreman. My job here is done. Is that what this is? She asked, her voice quiet, without accusation. A job? It's a trail, he said, finally meeting her eyes. I started on it a long time ago. A man's got to see where it ends. She nodded, a slow, understanding gesture that hurt more than any argument would have. Some trails just lead you in a circle back to where you started. Maybe. The word was heavy with things he couldn't say, but a man has to ride it to find out. The cabin door opened and Billy came out, blinking in the bright sun. He saw Rip, then his eyes went to the bedroll on the bay. The smile on his face vanished. You're leaving? Rip knelt, putting himself on the boy's level. I have to, Billy. I have business back in Texas. The boy's lower lip trembled. He looked from Rip to his mother and back again. He dug a small, grubby hand into the pocket of his overalls and pulled something out. He held it out on his open palm. It was a marble, not glass, but a heavy, dark steel ball bearing nicked and scarred from 1,000 playground battles. This is for luck, Billy said, his voice thick. It's a steely, it never loses. Rip looked at the small, offered treasure. He reached out and took it, the metal cool and heavy in his hand. It felt more real than the silver in his pocket. I'll keep it safe, he said, his own voice rough. He slipped the marble into his vest pocket, the one on the left side. He stood up. The goodbye was all said. There were no more words. He and Sarah just looked at each other. He saw the hurt in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw the same strength that had made her crawl through a creek bed in the dark. She would be all right. She was a survivor. The fences on the north pasture, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. The wires slack near the big rock, a calf could get through. She gave him a small, sad smile. I'll start there, she said. He put his hat back on. He turned, walked to the bay, and swung into the saddle. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He nudged the horse with his heels, and they started south, away from the cabin, away from the woman on the porch, away from the small boy who had given him all the luck he had. The country flattened out south of the Platte River, the green of the Johnson County Valley fading into a memory. The grass was sparser here, the hills lower and burned brown by the sun. The sky seemed bigger, emptier. It was country a man could get lost in, but Rip Campbell wasn't lost. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he was. He rode for 3 days, a steady, unhurried pace. He saw other riders only at a distance, lone specks of dust moving on the horizon. He skirted the few homesteads he came across, giving them a wide berth. The bay gelding moved with a quiet purpose, as if it too knew the trail was long. On the 3rd night, he made a cold camp in a shallow arroyo, the air too still and clear for a fire. He ate the last of the jerky Sarah had packed in his saddlebags and drank from his canteen. The silence was absolute. He sat with his back against his saddle, the Winchester across his lap, and watched the stars come out. They were the same stars that shone on Wyoming, but they felt different, colder, more distant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the money Horn had paid him, $40 in paper and coin. He didn't count it. He knew what was there. He fanned the bills with his thumb, the paper worn and soft. It was the price of a small war, the fee for services rendered. It was the reason he had ridden north. His fingers brushed against something else in his pocket, something small and heavy. He pulled it out and rolled it in his palm. The Steely. Billy McKenna's prize marble. In the faint starlight, the nicks and scars on its surface were invisible. It was just a perfect, dark sphere. It never loses. He closed his hand around it, the metal cool and solid against his skin. It felt heavier than all the silver dollars in the world. He didn't take out the folded piece of paper. The letter. It stayed where it was, tucked in the inside pocket of his coat. It was a letter from a man who had been ready to die in a barn. The man sitting in this arroyo was someone else. He wasn't sure who yet, but he knew he wasn't that man. He was no longer just running from a grave on the banks of the Sweetwater. The grief was still there, a low, steady ache like an old bone break, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. The siege, the fear, the impossible bravery of a woman crawling through a creek bed in the dark. It had all burned something clean in him. He had ridden into Johnson County a ghost, a man defined by what he had lost. He was riding out of it a man defined by what he had survived. He thought of the trail ahead. Texas. He had told Horn and Sarah it was where he was going, and it was. But he knew now it wasn't the destination. It was just the direction. He wasn't going back to a life he'd left behind. He was going to see if he could build a new one. Maybe it would have a green door. Maybe it would just have 4 solid walls and a tight roof. He didn't know. The not knowing was no longer a thing to be feared. The bay snorted in the darkness, pulling him from his thoughts. Rip stood up, stretched the stiffness from his back, and rolled himself in his blanket. The ground was hard, but he was used to it. He slept. At dawn, he was riding again. The sun was at his back, casting his long shadow ahead of him on the trail. He rode until noon when the land began to change again, rising into a series of low, broken hills. He topped a rise and reined in the bay. Below him, the trail split. One fork continued south, a dusty, well-worn track leading toward the distant promise of Texas. The other fork angled northwest, a fainter trail, less certain, disappearing into the vast, empty plains. It was a trail that would, eventually, lead back toward Wyoming. He sat his horse for a long time, looking from one path to the other. The wind stirred the dry grass, the only sound in the immense silence. He reached into his vest, his fingers finding the cool, solid weight of the steel marble. He didn't look at it. He just felt it there, a small, heavy piece of luck. He looked back over his shoulder to the north. He couldn't see the mountains of Johnson County, couldn't see anything but the endless roll of the prairie. But he looked anyway, a long, quiet gaze, as if he could see the smoke rising from a chimney on a small ranch, as if he could hear a boy's laughter on the wind. Then he turned his head and faced forward. He nudged the bay with his heels, and horse and rider moved on, their shadow leading the way down the southern fork of the trail.